So if I could ask the other two speakers to come to the stage as well. So if there are any questions, if you could move to the microphones on the side, and there's one coming.
I have a question for Orly. At the beginning of your talk, you kind of contrasted your approach, kind of looking at some of the local practices as opposed to some of the kind of global contexts they're operating in. But I was curious to hear a little bit more of your thoughts on these specific emerging practices you identified. Where do they come from, in the sense of, are they kind of bubbling up in these sites? Is there some kind of common sense emerging among the consultants that are, as you point out, kind of, you know, operating on large scales in multiple different cities? Like, is there some kind of like global pressure actually that's quite compatible with your story, or is that not what's going on?
I think that's a really good question, and I think you're right. Whoops. I think you're right to say that it's not really a dichotomy between the local practices and the global practices. I think one of the underlying themes that I didn't really talk about here is really how the nature of firms is changing. So we're looking at the rise of planning mega firms globally. The recent experiences in Canada with the buyout of MMM, as well as many of our other Canadian firms, there are very few firms that are left that occupy that sort of middle ground space. So the firms that I were looking at either were incredibly small, one or two principals, and they did a lot of urban design policy work for the city, or they were these very large firms like AECOM and Parsons Brinckerhoff. And I think some of those entrepreneurial goals that these firms have, aside from the goals of good urban design and urban design practice, influence, I think, sort of that shifting of practice to an extent. And that's not to say that, you know, the principals of these firms or the people working for them are not interested in improving our cities and having spaces that function well, but I think there's also, you know, a profit motive behind these firms that, especially when there's a lack of public sector oversight and capacity, that has the potential to flourish.
Questions for Neil, and one that you might be expecting from me.
I never know what to expect from you, Patrick.
Yeah, no. Well, I think you do on this one. With the deepest respect, I think that the audience might like to hear from you why a set of policies, or not even policies, procedures, which are infinitely loose, as you've described, and not bounded by anything even resembling a plan, and a process that is admittedly resembles very much spot zoning, a practice that is illegal in some jurisdictions, is such a good idea here. That's part one. Part two is similar. Did that process that worked, and I think the genesis of that process was in the 80s and 90s, during a period where we were repopulating the downtown with a middle class, does it still retain its moral authority or its goodness under present circumstances where we have a city that's expelling the middle class from most of these new developments? And if you'll indulge me, just one more thing. Under that circumstances, is it not possible that a procedure that was good for the collective of the city in the 80s and 90s now is as can be viewed with the same suspicion that Orly views pro bono work, where the people on the design panel, for example, are mostly the same architects, many times the same architects, whose job it is to do these major projects, such as the one seen in the distant vista in the signature image that we're using in this forum.
Well, thank you for that, because I think you're hitting at some things I kind of glossed over in the nature of time. So the first question is the disconnect between these day-to-day practices and what for planners are really important, more formal processes of policy setting and aspiration setting, and particularly in the case of Vancouver, which lacks the type of detail one. That's not to say that the Vancouver model or this kind of negotiated, informal, discretionary-based system is not rooted in policy. It is. There's a lot of policy in place. It just lacks the typical cover that we would see for an official community plan in Vancouver. It's almost always rooted in policy. What is technically referred to as a spot zoning is actually kind of rare in the city. It does happen. And one might argue it should happen. That we need to have a system that is able to identify an opportunity and come up with a context and site-specific solution. That we're not overly bound by a sort of a point-in-time picture of what our city needs to be. That said, it's really difficult when you have a process, and every city does this, right? Does these kind of decisions, day-to-day decision-making, that is disconnected from a big picture policy in a really clear way. And the decision-making is so fragmented that how does a public wrap its head around it? And a policy gets its real gravitas for its ability to shape decisions, right? Does the council or the whoever official takes these into account when they make the small scale decision? And the policy framework works well only when it's rooted in a broader public good and aspiration. And by fracturing it, as I think the Vancouver system does, that makes it difficult. And the responsiveness of the Vancouver model to a broader public aspiration is problematic. And I think we see that now today, because a set of principles I think worked really well, and a way of working that worked really well, and created a type of downtown, for example, that's just one obviously bigger, that has succeeded in its goals of living, of creating a desirable residential community, has had its flip side in also being works really well with global capital and high and real estate investment. So this is part of my contention is, or where I think we need to be talking more in our community, is well, we got to rethink of how we evaluate these things. Do we need to, and particularly, like I said, it's been 20 plus years since City Plan. What kind of public conversations are needed to root this kind of complex dynamic system into a recognition of the challenges we have in the city before us and the types of city that we need it to be? And that is, in fact, quite frankly, I think we are in danger of retreating away from that because it's been so long since we've had that kind of community conversation. And quite frankly, from what I see, sort of from the inside looking in, is a retreat to a more architectural-driven approach to design. Right, so the conversation that happens through this design approval process become very much about the function of a building. And how do we root it to a broader conversation? So the other way I look at it is we have a negative sort of a perception of urban design. A building isn't bad. It doesn't shadow excessively. It doesn't block views excessively. And it doesn't have negative impacts on the street. But we need a more positive influence. How does a building contribute to a better urbanism that's more fitting from our time? That's a bit of a ramble. I appreciate the question, though.
I have a similar concern like Patrick has. As Neil, you just told about discretionary zoning as Vancouver follows. It has advantages like flexibility, but I'd like to know how transparent is that process, because the final verdict and final decision has been taken by the director of planning. So how transparent that process is and how you just quantify that?
So thank you, Shikeen. This takes a slight term, which is really important and valuable. So the question I always have about Vancouver is, so Vancouver generally works. It's a city I think that we live here are generally proud of. It has issues and we work through them, but a lot of that, again, as I described, is because it's discretionary. But discretion has so many dangers. And how does discretion work to the positive, to the benefit of the city, and not get captured? And I think Orly illustrated so well actually some of the dangers actually that are involved in urban design performance, so or design processes. So, yes, that kind of system does put a lot of decision-making power to a very small group of people. Now, when it's well designed, and actually I would say that happens everywhere. The question then is, how do we design that process? How do we design it so that we can take advantage of its benefits, the flexibility, its ability to champion good ideas, without falling prey of lack of responsiveness to a public good, to a public conversation, that it gets easily, dominated by the same group of people, old white male architects and planners like myself, and get into that. That is a really key question. We have to find ways of opening up that discretionary process and keeping it really alive and like reinvesting its moral authority. I think that's where we are at now. It's not meant to be critical of where we're at today. It's just a reminder that we must do this on an ongoing basis. I just think it's been a while since we've done it here locally.
Maga, did you have a question? You're kind of, yeah.
Well, I was just going to back up, and it seems like do we still have time? Sure. So thank you for the three panelists. Very thought-provoking talks, all three of them. My question is for Amr. I found your talk very informative as Egyptian-born and Canadian-trained. I had never quite appreciated that perspective on growth, and the way you captured sort of the institutional, post hoc sanctioning of breaking the city's own codes causes all sorts of problems. So I'd like you to cast it in a light of both state corruption in the state breaking its own law, but also corruption in the processes of building and permitting and approving additional heights and the kinds of civic hazards that places on the population. Thank you.
Okay, this was supposedly going to be part of the presentation, but I didn't have time. So technically the buildings are, like the bylaw breaking buildings are breaking the bylaw, but they are not in the same time. So some examples of how they do that. So say I'm a developer, I buy a piece of land. This is basically how Nasr City became what it is. Buy a piece of land, get a permit for a 5-story building. And then I build a 10-story building. And then I go back to the administrative authority for Nasr City, and I tell them, hey, I built a 10-story building. Can you please send somebody to assess the building and see if it's structurally sound? Now, it's up to the discretion of that official to say whether, regardless of whether or not it's structurally sound, should it stay up, or do they issue a demolition permit? So if the developer, which he usually does, pays off the official to say that it's structurally sound, it should stay, and a fine is issued for the developer, which, and this is the tricky part, is like a fraction of the official price of the land per floor, which is nothing given the actual price of land as it is and how much money the developer is going to make selling apartments in the first 2 floors of the other 5, okay? If he doesn't get past that and the official says, no, I don't want your bribe, this thing is going to be demolished, he has another way of, if he gets to sell a unit in one of the upper floors, it gets grandfathered in because we have laws that says you can't evict people that had bought that. So it becomes if, say, he puts somebody in the 9th floor, then the rest of the building is fine, okay? And if that also fails, and they do issue an order for demolition, the authority that issues the order and the authority that carries it out are 2 separate entities. And if a year passes between issuing the order and executing it, it drops. So again, the developer can go and like bribe the authority that would demolish the building to just hold off for a year, and then the building gets like grandfathered in. That all happened, like this, like rampant corruption is basically because of what happened in the 70s. So we switched out, like the regime, again without referring to the people at all, switched from socialism to supposedly capitalism, but they kept a lot of the socialist policies just to like avert social unrest. They didn't want to cancel free education, they didn't want to cancel government employment policies. So that resulted in that like really big, inefficient bureaucracy that allowed for this to happen. So does that answer the question?
And then the building collapses.
Yeah, that we had a streak of that because greed. Yeah, like we basically were like, okay, we're not only gonna like build 10-story buildings when it should be 5. We'll build them with like messed up concrete and failing like reinforcement steel, and just like they fall on people. So yeah.
I know there's one more question. Hopefully you can hold that question until the next session. We want to move on for our break. We have a 15-minute break, and then we're coming back at 3:45. And there's complimentary tea and coffee in the lobby.